Welcome to the Middle East Forum of Falmouth. My name's Mark Schulman. I'm the president of NEF. Today's webinar features Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, and his lecture is entitled Israel in 2023, A Perfect Storm of Crises. We're going to get right to this, and I'm going to turn the program over to my colleague, Alan Taylor, and who will introduce Ambassador Kurtzer and tell us how we're going to do the Q&A period.
Okay, so thank you, Mark, and welcome Ambassador Kurtzer, and welcome to the audience. We're delighted to have you with us for this last talk of the season. Ambassador Kurtzer is the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton in the School of Public and International Affairs. During a 29-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, Ambassador Kurtzer served as the United States Ambassador to Israel and as the United States Ambassador to Egypt. So it's a thrill to have somebody with the depth of his experience with us. Ambassador Kurtzer played an instrumental role in helping to bring about the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference, which was an unprecedented gathering of all the parties to the Arab-Israeli conflict for direct negotiations. This was during the presidency of George Bush Sr. Ambassador Kurtzer served as the U.S. representative to the bilateral talks between Israel and Palestinians and between Israel and Syria. Ambassador Kurtzer is the co-author of Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, American Leadership in the Middle East, and the co-author of The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, the 1989 to 2011, and the editor of Pathways to Peace, America and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. His most recent article with Aaron David Miller is Getting Israeli-Saudi Rapprochement Right. No deal is better than a bad one. And not least of his qualifications is in 2007, he was named the first commissioner of the Professional Israeli Baseball League. Now, again, we have his wonderful talk, Israel in 2023, A Perfect Storm of Crises follows appropriately. And this talk follows appropriately after two out of the last three talks we had, which was one was by Friedman in the Middle East is once again West Africa, and Zumlat's talk, 75 years of Nakba, we're next to Palestine. And I think you'll see these themes brought back again in the talk today. Thank you very much and welcome, Ambassador Kurtzer.
Well, thank you very much, Mark and Alan, for the invitation to join you. I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., which is a beautiful city, but I envy you, those of you who are in Cape Cod, and maybe one day I will join you there. The topic, A Perfect Storm of Crises, in some respects, could have been spoken about many times over the past 75 years. Israel has faced a number of challenges since its Declaration of Independence in 1948. It has overcome many of those challenges and continues to prosper. But there is a singular difference between what's happening today and what has happened in the past, and that is that there's this combination of very significant internal unrest within Israeli society, a continuation and intensification of the Israeli-Palestinian dimension of the conflict, a region which is in upheaval, as you've heard over the several weeks of this Middle East Forum. But at the same time, there have been some interesting developments, particularly in the area of Israeli relations with some Arab states, that seem to run counter to this trend. So I wanted to try to dissect this today and leave time for questions on where things are heading. What constitutes this perfect storm? As you know, a perfect storm is when many bad things happen at the same time, largely at the same place. The first place to start, of course, is the effort by the current coalition in Israel, the most right-wing, radical, in some respects racist coalition that Israel has ever had, to effect a judicial overhaul. in a variety of areas. Number one, the way judges are selected, whether or not the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, can override Supreme Court decisions and by what number of votes, and a variety of other ways that would essentially gut much of the judiciary's independence. That has brought tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands of Israelis to the streets every week since January, and has created a domestic crisis that Israel has never really seen before. There have been protests at various times in the course of Israel's history, but the fact that this has persisted for so long and has brought together a very interesting coalition that goes from left to right. There are settlers who are part of this protest. There are progressives on the left. And it's been quite a show of opposition to the current coalition's policies. While that's happening, though, the coalition is also planning a series of moves that would effectively continue what has been the creeping annexation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem to Israel proper. I wrote an article some weeks ago that suggested that, in fact, the coalition is playing chess, the rest of us are playing checkers, because they tend to see this as a long-term battle to incorporate all of the occupied territories into Israel and effectively annex them. The judicial overhaul debate is one aspect of their strategy, but it's not the end of their strategy. And so you see a series of legislative actions that are designed to tie the territories and to tie the Israeli citizens who live in those territories much more closely to Israel proper. While this is happening, there's been an intensification of violence by Palestinians and counter-violence, particularly by Israeli settlers. Particularly in the northern West Bank, groups have emerged that are not under the thumb of the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, and they're not under the thumb of Hamas or Islamic Jihad. They are new groups, largely, in fact, the children of mainstream Palestinians who are fed up. They've had it. And they've now created various groupings in Jenin and Nablus, the two bigger cities in that area, that are carrying out individual attacks against Israelis almost every day. We read about the most serious of those, which often lead to Israeli reprisals. But even when we're not reading about them in the papers, the security situation on the ground has really deteriorated. And what's contributed to that is the reaction of radical settlers who have taken it upon themselves to carry out reprisals. They're called price tag actions. In other words, to effect a price for every action that Palestinians undertake. And some of them have been horrific. You recall a few months ago, there was what the Israeli army called a pogrom in the Palestinian city of Huwara after 2 Israelis were killed in that city. What's been interesting is the degree to which the army and the security services have not been able to clamp down either on the Palestinian violence or on the Israeli settler counter-violence. Part of that reason is because 2 of the most significant members of the coalition of Prime Minister Netanyahu actually control much of what happens in the West Bank. The Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, also has a role in controlling the civil administration in the West Bank. And the Minister of Public Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, now has something of his own private army as well as control of the police. And he's created an atmosphere which is quite toxic. So you have these situations that are occurring on top of the internal unrest and domestic unrest within Israel. Hezbollah, the Islamic resistance group in Lebanon, has used this occasion to up its own activities. There have been some shells across the border, and they've entrenched themselves quite seriously along the southern border of Lebanon, the northern border of Israel. There's been some shelling from Gaza. You remember not long ago, there was an outbreak of shelling, and then a year ago, there was a more serious confrontation. And while this is happening, the two governments involved, the coalition in Israel that I described earlier, and the Palestinian government have been dysfunctional. Palestinian Authority, as you know, has control only in the West Bank and not in Gaza. It doesn't really control much in the West Bank as well. It provides salaries for many workers, but its reach in terms of governance is rather limited. This is occurring against the backdrop of the picture that completes this perfect storm of a region which is in rather significant transformation. And you probably heard some of this from Chaz Friedman and others over the past weeks. The Biden administration made it a priority to try to resume the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran to try to stop the Iranian nuclear program. That has not been successful. And after President Trump pulled out of that agreement in 2018, Iran began again to enrich uranium and is now enriching uranium at more than 60%, which is rather close to its ability to create the material for a nuclear weapon. The breakout time, the time between where Iran is in its program and where it would need to be a nuclear power state, is now down to a couple of months, according to experts. At the time of the JCPOA, it had been perhaps over a year, but because of the enriched uranium issue, it has now been reduced significantly. And so this becomes the large elephant in the room, because it is the most significant security, perhaps even existential problem that the state of Israel faces. There's also been an intensification of clashes in Syria between Israel and Iranian proxies. Again, we don't read that much about it in the press, but it is a daily occurrence in which Israeli Air Force, sometimes using its own proxies on the ground, engage with Iranian proxies, sometimes directly with Syrian government military, with Israel trying its best to deny Iran a foothold in Syria, which would, if it occurred, effectively give them a land bridge to Hezbollah in Lebanon and a land bridge to the Mediterranean Sea. From a security perspective, that would be a nightmare, not just for Israel, but for other states in the region, including Lebanon, Jordan, and others. So you have this extraordinary array of activities occurring at the same time, putting tremendous stress on an Israeli political system, which is stressed in ways that it has never been stressed before. And it's a system being governed by, I don't have kind words, as you can imagine, for the Israeli coalition. It's a combination of racists, misogynists, homophobes, who have an agenda that is quite radical. And as much as they declare in their Facebook and Twitter posts that they represent the majority of the Israeli people, what the demonstrations are showing us in Israel is that the government doesn't represent the majority, and yet they're hanging together in the government because they don't want to test that in another election. The implications for Israel, the region, and for the United States of all of this are rather significant. The implications for Israel will only really be played out when the next election takes place. The polling is showing that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the current coalition will lose rather significantly if there's another election. But excuse me, but polling in Israel has never been that precise, as we know from our own experience here in the United States. And Netanyahu is really the wild card in all of the assessments of Israeli domestic politics. There are many on the right in Israel who want to remain on the right, but don't want Netanyahu as the leader. And there are others on the right who will turn further right if Netanyahu is not the leader of Likud, for example. So domestic politics in Israel are quite challenging right now, and we're not going to really know where things turn out until elections take place. And as you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu is desperate not to have elections, not only because he wants to continue governing, but also because he faces several indictments and hopes that through continuing to govern, a way can be found to absolve him of, or to push these indictments aside or to defer them long enough that they go away. One of the questions that's been raised is whether or not all of this political turmoil is having an effect on the Israeli economy. I think, as you know, the Israeli economy has been extraordinarily strong. They now have a larger gross domestic product per capita than Japan. Their economy is larger than almost every European country. Their high-tech sector remains a gem and the envy of every other country in the world. And yet we're starting to see signs of some stress. Two of the rating agencies, Fitch's and Moody's, have talked about downgrading Israel's rating, borrowing rating. There is talk, although it's not yet clear, but there's talk of some high-tech firms taking their business offshore, either to Cyprus, Europe, or to the United States. High-tech, of course, being highly mobile. And there has been, at least anecdotally, a drop-off in foreign direct investment over this past year, with concerns about the stability of the political system holding some investors back, at least for the time being. So this challenging environment has not been cost-free for the Israeli economy. There's also been pressure, which is quite separate in its causes, in the sector of the Israeli Arab community. About 20% of Israel are Arab citizens, full citizens of the state. And for a variety of reasons, social economic distress, the growth of gangs and crime bosses, there's been a very significant outbreak of crime in that sector. Somewhere over 150 Israeli Arab citizens have been killed already in internecine fighting within that sector, and that doesn't portend well for the stability of 20% of the Israeli population. The broader implications, though, are mixed for Israel. As I mentioned at the outset, even while all of these challenging issues are occurring, there's good news. In 2020, as you remember, 4 Arab countries decided to effectively normalize relations with Israel: United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. They did so in part because of benefits that the United States provided, several of them. But the fact is that the relations, which had been very much under the radar for many, many years, now came out in the open. And the UAE, for example, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel have a thriving relationship, tourism and technology. While that's happening, there's talk about the possibility of Israeli-Saudi normalization. Some of you may have seen the article that the Middle East Forum circulated that I had written with my colleague Aaron Miller, which suggested that a successful Israeli-Saudi normalization would be transformational in the region, but for it to be effective, it had to have a strong enough Palestinian component that might make it impossible to achieve, because it would ask Israel for a number of measures that we can talk about in the Q&A that the current Israeli coalition might not be willing to give. The Biden administration, as you probably have seen, has expressed some interest in this. and has ramped up its diplomacy on this issue. The president himself has been a little bit more cautious in his public comments, but clearly this is something on the agenda. So even while all of these other, what I would say, problematic issues are occurring, there is this possibility of a breakthrough at some point, which would, in many respects, bring about an end of the Israeli-Arab conflict. It may not end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and there will still be some Arab states, Algeria, Libya, Syria for sure. There'll be others, Islamic states like Iran, that will oppose. But if Saudi Arabia can be brought into the orbit of peace, effectively the Arab-Israeli conflict will have come to an end. But while those positive actions or events are occurring in the region, there's also a mix of activities that are still unclear. The good news, we saw just today that Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan are resuming talks about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and its impact on water. There is an extension of the Yemen ceasefire, which will end one of the more brutal conflicts in this, or we hope will end one of the more brutal conflicts in the region. Situations elsewhere are not as conducive to solution, but the Middle East is not the old Middle East that we knew and were kind of comfortable with. The United States' position is less sure in this region. We are perceived as pivoting away from the region and paying less attention. To some extent, that's not inaccurate, particularly in the Biden administration, which inherited, as we all know, a range of domestic priorities that it wanted to deal with, and has focused its international agenda on China, Russia, Ukraine, and Iran, as well as ramping up our diplomatic engagement with parts of Africa, some of which will have to be ramped up even further given the coup recently in Niger. So you have this mix of positive and negative developments, some of which draw inspiration from what's happening on the Arab-Israeli and Israeli scenes, some of which are happening almost in contradistinction to what's happening on the ground in Israel. And therefore, it's a very challenging moment to look at this perfect storm of crises. Finally, the impact on U.S.-Israeli relations as a result of all of this. First of all, there's been no impact at all on ongoing bilateral programs. We have not only the major aid program, $3.8 billion per year in military assistance, and another probably close to $1 billion a year in joint research and development on anti-missile and anti-rocket activities. None of that has been impacted. The United States has participated actively in what's called the Negev Forum, which is a group of several countries, including Egypt, that is looking for ways to build economic and other kinds of ties. The United States conducted its largest exercise ever with Israel, called Juniper Oak, back in January. Last year, we signed a enhanced strategic partnership, which was designed to cement what's called a qualitative military edge, which is a commitment, longstanding commitment of the United States to maintain Israel's military advantage over any combination of Arab foes. We are participating in what's called the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. As you know, the discovery of natural gas in the Mediterranean has created tremendous economic opportunities. The Biden administration helped oversee an agreement between Israel and Lebanon that marked the maritime boundaries so that both countries could begin serious exploration and exploitation of gas. And there's been significant private sector cooperation flowing from a new group called I2U2. It's Israel, India, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States that's looking at water, energy, and food security. So on the plus side, there has been almost a flowering of a relationship between our two countries, which was always very good. On the other hand, as you have seen, President Biden's rhetoric about the debate within Israel on judicial overhaul has called into question whether or not Israel is heading in the right direction in terms of its commitment to democracy. And whereas we normally talk about our relations with Israel in terms of values and interests, while the interests remain the same, the question that the president has raised is whether our values are still parallel, if not complementary. The final note here is a debate that has come out in the open very recently over whether or not it's time for the United States to change its aid relationship with Israel. As I mentioned, Israel's economy no longer needs aid. In fact, they can pay for what they need. The fact that they're receiving aid actually absolves them of the responsibility to make hard choices. Do we buy another F-35, or do we do something for the Israeli Arab sector, or for poor Bedouins in the south, or for other domestic priorities? Education in Israel has always been underfunded, and the aid provides a bit of a buffer to allow Israel to at least provide some money for education that it might not otherwise. The other argument, of course, is that aid provides a kind of enabling mechanism for Israel to continue occupation in the West Bank. If they have a cushion of $4 or $5 billion, which we provide, that's $4 or $5 billion that they can spend on settlement activity and promoting this creeping annexation of the territories. For those interested, and I am prepared to talk about it more in the Q&A, former Minister of Justice in Israel, Yossi Beilin, he was former Deputy Prime Minister as well, and I co-authored an article, I think it's now 3 years ago, in Foreign Policy magazine, which said it is time to phase out our military assistance, but to phase in at least two agreements between our two countries. One, an agreement that would assure Israel access to the weaponry that it needs. It would have to buy it, but we wouldn't be able to shut down any of Israel's requests. And secondly, we propose the creation of a joint mechanism like what we have in agriculture and in other areas for the two countries to cooperate on the R&D, research and development, in military and security technology, with both of us contributing equal amounts of money and sharing equally from the benefits. So our proposal is not simply a cut in aid, but it's a change in the very nature of our relationship, putting Israel into a position of independence with respect to its decision-making on securing its security needs, but ensuring that the United States remains open to Israel's requirements when Israel decides to purchase from us. So what I've tried to do briefly is to paint this picture of a challenging situation, a perfect storm, but it is not a perfect storm in all the respects that the movie showed us, the Tom Hanks movie, where almost nothing ever went right. There are some positive issues at play here, and therefore there's still room to see how we can translate some of the negatives into the positives. With that, Alan, I'd be happy to take questions and engage with your participants.
Well, thank you so much for a really informative and provocative talk. It's amazing how much information you convey so concisely and clearly. Thank you. We have many questions. So for those in the audience whose question I do not repeat, it's because there are just too many coming in. So the first question, it says, in your foreign affairs article, you state, quote, the USA should preserve the possibility of a two-state solution, stop de facto annexation of the West Bank. And in your talk, You also suggested that the territories and settlement is not the end strategy. Question is there still a geopolitical possibility for two-state solution? And what might that look like? Or is there a chance for a one-state solution?
That's a great question in general, but also in particular because there's a book out and an article in Foreign Affairs called The One State Reality, which basically says that the possibility of two states has faded from being realized. There are too many settlers, too many settlements, too much Israeli control, Palestinian governance is fragmented. And therefore, even if it's not our preference, the reality is one state. Problem with a one state outcome is that there is not enough support in either community for it. For Israel, a one state reality would pose a Hobbesian choice. They could either have one state that provides for full citizenship for all of its citizens, meaning about 50% of Israeli citizens would be Palestinians, and that would call into question the basic purpose of Zionism, or hopefully not, a second alternative, which is a one-state reality that does not provide citizenship for Palestinians. And not I, but Israelis themselves, including former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, has called that eventuality an apartheid reality. If there were a state in which Israel exercised complete control, but without citizenship granted to its citizens. So in Israel, there's no support for a one-state outcome. In Palestine, among the Palestinians, there is some growing support, but not even close to a majority. So this one-state reality becomes a continuation and intensification of a very bad status quo. And as we were talking about before the session, status quos are not static, and they tend to get worse. And as we've seen, this status quo is getting worse, particularly as settlers feel their oats and are now taking retribution against Palestinians outside of legal means. So is there a reason to try to maintain a two-state reality? Yes. Or two-state outcome? Yes. Is it hard? Oh, yes, very hard. It will take a significant amount of determination on the part of the United States, the international community, and enough Israelis to vote for a government that is prepared to think about the kinds of compromises that need to be made to get to two states.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. Another question that I think is somewhat related is, please comment on the idea that putting one's hopes in the outcome of a future election will be in vain if the current coalition succeeds in pushing through its judicial overhaul, because that will obviously include changing the rules so that no court will be able to monitor decisions by the Central Elections Committee. And that committee will disqualify Arab Israeli parties or politicians from participating in future elections.
You know, as much as there's been a crisis for the past 7 months now about the prospect of the judicial overhaul, the real crisis is just a few weeks away when the Supreme Court takes up the first of these controversial bills that has to do with what's called the reasonableness of legislation. You know, Israel doesn't have a written constitution. They have a series of basic laws. And over time, the Supreme Court, which also sits as a high court of justice, it's a very unusual situation. As a high court of justice, it's a court of first appeal, which means that any citizen can put a case before the High Court of Justice. The Supreme Court and the High Court of Justice have adopted a standard of reasonableness to disqualify laws and to disqualify government decisions. For example, Netanyahu, when he won the election last November, wanted to appoint Aryeh Deri, the head of the Shas party, as the minister in 2 different ministries with a promise to become the finance minister. The problem is that Deri not only been indicted several times for corruption, but has been in jail for corruption. He was convicted. And the Supreme Court found that that was not reasonable for the government to appoint Aryeh Deri as a minister. The Knesset passed a law that disqualifies the court from adopting the reasonableness standard. And the court now is going to take up that law and quite likely is going to say that the law itself is not reasonable. And that's when your crisis is going to occur. So I don't have an answer as to whether or not, the continuation of this coalition permanently can create permanent damage, because we're probably in the third inning, if we keep our baseball analogy, or maybe the second quarter in a football analogy of a game that has yet to be completed.
Thanks so much. So in your article, now going back to your article in Foreign Affairs, you state that Palestinians should be willing to enhance security cooperation with Israel and to commit to holding democratic elections. So the question is, how is that possible? Who might be a candidate for their government, for the equivalent of their Congress, if you will? And the last time that happened, Hamas won the election in Gaza. So that throws another monkey wrench into sort of confidence about the process.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, the elections in 2006, which Hamas won, not only in Gaza, they won the legislative elections in the West Bank and Gaza. Those elections were declared by President George W. Bush to be free and fair. He then went on to say, but nonetheless, we're not going to relate to that government. In other words, you had a good election, but I'm not going to talk to you anyway. So the Palestinians have the capability of running a free and fair election. They are open to international observers. They have a central elections committee, which in 2021, when there was the prospect of elections, came out with kind of normal rules and regulations. There are two issues that would need to be dealt with. One is voting in East Jerusalem. In 2006 and previously, East Jerusalem Palestinians were permitted to vote. The question is, would the current Israeli coalition agree this time around? And the second issue is Hamas, as you mentioned. Hamas, as a political movement, would probably end up disqualifying the elections entirely. But there are indications that Hamas is prepared to put forward candidates who are not, quote unquote, card-carrying members. In other words, those who support Hamas, but are not paid by the organization or the movement, or not, they don't serve in a leadership role, which would effectively give them a voice in government, but could be, if there was enough willingness on the part of Israel to accept this, could be an acceptable alternative to having elections disqualified because of formal Hamas participation. So, it's really just a question if people really want these elections to take place. In the article, I think Aaron and I were suggesting that elections in Palestine are important enough that the United States ought to take a much stronger, or adopt a much stronger position and creative position to help resolve some of these issues. I joke around, I've been at Princeton now for almost 18 years since leaving the Foreign Service. My initial appointment was for 3 years. So I'm like the president of Palestine. I'm in the 18th year of a 3-year appointment, and he's in the 18th year of a 5-year election. So both of us need a little renewal. I'm happy to keep teaching, but he does need to face elections of his people.
But is Abbas willing to do that? I mean, based on what you know, is there enough momentum to? Well,
he was in 2021. He announced elections in 2021, and then he got cold feet and blamed it on the Jerusalem issue. He said, Israel's not going to allow us to have Jerusalem, and therefore we can't do it. But it hadn't been tested. Nobody had really pushed the issue then. This was before the current coalition came to power. And it might have been possible to find a way to deal with this. And there are creative ways, absentee ballots, e-voting, voting at post office. I mean, there are ways to deal with this. Part of what Abbas's concern, however, was that I think he was afraid he's going to lose. And that's not an excuse not to have an election. You know, you stand for what you stand for, and you put your fate into the people's hands. And that's where I think we and the rest of the international community can play a much stronger role.
Thank you. Now moving back to your point about Iran, and this is a question that doesn't directly address what you talked about in terms of Iran being an existential threat to Israel, but if you would think more broadly or respond to a broader question, I said, can you comment on the likely effects of BRICS, you know, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and these other countries you just mentioned, expanding to include Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt, and how will this new coalition affect the Middle East, and how will it alter the U.S. influence in the Middle East?
Well, there's no question that that the expansion of BRICS, I think there are now 6 or 7 new countries, not just Iran, but Egypt is involved and several others, got the attention of Washington, but largely got the attention of Washington for political reasons, not for economic reasons. Aside from China, even the expanded BRICS membership is a rather sorry state of economically poor countries. Russia is in deep distress. Egypt, you know, maybe too large to fail, but all the indications are that if left alone, it would fail. And you go down the list, Brazil is probably in better shape and so forth. But there's no economic contest here. The United States, the North Atlantic partnerships that we have, the new Pacific partnerships that we have still dominate the international economic scene. And the concern that some people have that BRICS may come up with a different currency because they are starting to trade in some of their local currencies, kind of barter arrangement. I think it's decades away and it's probably never going to happen. The dollar is simply too ensconced as the medium for international trade. So BRICS as a politics issue, as a policy issue, I think is important. China in particular has 2 important stakes in the Middle East. One, of course, is its need for energy, and the other is the expansion of its own economic footprint. They did play a role in bringing about Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, which Washington applauded as it brought some stability. But BRICS per se, I think, is not going to be the issue. For me, the issue is, does the United States still see this region as important for our national security interests? And if you think outside of the normal response, which is, well, we support Israel, which we do, we also have interests with respect to energy security, counterterrorism, a lot of bad terrorists still wandering around the Middle East and its outskirts, and counterproliferation. You know, not only is Iran possibly a nuclear threshold state, but as part of the Israel-Saudi negotiations, the Saudis may ask for a civilian nuclear program with enrichment. It's in the article that Aaron and I wrote. And if the United States agrees to that, it would be the first time ever that we had agreed proactively, as it were, to enrichment outside of the already existing nuclear powers. So there are very significant U.S. interests in this region that I think will keep us there and belie the question of whether or not we are pivoting away or we're somehow walking away. We're not, in practical terms.
Okay, thank you. Now you're an ambassador and you probably have a lot more information about behind the scenes things. We're wondering as a group, What can you tell us about these tier 2 talks? Is there something substantive going on behind the scenes?
Well, if I told you all, I'd have to kill you all. You know the expression. No, the reality is none of us knows what's going on in whatever back channels are taking place. Based on experience, we saw in the 2013, 2015 negotiations with Iran on what became the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that the formal negotiations were not making much progress. But it was only when the United States and Iran opened up a back channel hosted by Oman that we actually cut the deal. And then we brought that deal to the formal negotiations for a kind of ratification. I am pretty sure, I don't know this, that there has not really been a back channel until now on the substance of the nuclear program. There has been a back channel on other issues like prisoners. Some were just released. It's going to lead to the release of some Iranian assets. So there are efforts underway behind the scenes to continue to free American, call them prisoners, call them hostages, those who are incarcerated in Iran. But I am not persuaded, and I hope I'm wrong, frankly, but I'm not persuaded that there is a channel on the nuclear issue that's taken place. I have heard from our negotiators that, in fact, the Iranians will not even talk to us in the room with the other 5 parties, the Russians, Chinese, British, French, and Germans. So that group of 5 meets with the Iranians, and then they meet with us, and then they go back to the Iranians. It's kind of a strange way of doing business. So I'm not really sure there is a lot of behind the scenes substance in the nuclear talks.
Mm-hmm. So pushing that a little bit, do you think that Iran is really a security threat to Israel, or is this sort of being used by both parties, as a whipping boy to fan up internal support for governments?
To digress one moment, we're coming on the 50th anniversary of the 1973 war. And one of the analytical outcomes from that war was the degree to which Israel relied upon an assessment of intentions as opposed to an assessment of capabilities. In other words, the Israelis knew that the Egyptians were doing what they were doing and they had the capability, but they assessed Egypt's intention to be that they wouldn't do it, that they were afraid of losing another war. Now, I mention that now because Israel in 2023 is not going to make an assessment that Iran really doesn't have an intention to carry out an attack on Israel. They are going to focus on the capability of Iran. Does Iran have both a nuclear capability, missile technology, delivery systems, and so forth? And if that's the case, it will trigger a very significant Israeli reaction. Whether it's a military reaction, whether it's a call for UN sanctions, whether it's whatever. The Israelis are not simply going to rely on the hope that Iran really doesn't intend to attack Israel. You have to recall that during the JCPOA negotiations, one of the more moderate Iranian leaders, Rafsanjani, noted in an interview that if Iran had a nuclear weapon, it could wipe out 2/3 of Israel with one shot, given the degree to which the Israeli population lives together rather in close proximity along the coastline. So you're not going to see an Israel that relies upon an assessment of intentions. And that's why stopping the Iranian program, the actual program, is critically important to bringing down the temperature in this relationship.
Thank you very much. Now turning back to something more focused about possibilities of creating an environment for peace between Israel and Palestinians. How important is the Palestinian indoctrination of children for martyrdom as a barrier to peace? And is there a reciprocal teaching of hate on the other side? Or is there some kind of alternative that's evolving where both sides are cooling the temperature in terms of the children that they're bringing up?
Well, first of all, there is no Palestinian indoctrination of martyrdom. There are Palestinians who teach their children martyrdom, but it is not the policy or the practice of the mainstream Palestinian Authority. There have been several important studies of Palestinian textbooks based on complaints that they are continuing incitement, and those studies have not found the kind of incitement that that brought about the studies to begin with. Both sides are not doing enough to teach coexistence. So you will find in Palestinian textbooks maps of Palestine that don't show the state of Israel. And you will see in Israeli textbooks maps of Israel that show nothing that says that there's a Palestinian entity. It's Israel, Judea, and Samaria. So both sides, to more or less degree, are guilty of failing to create a culture of peace. This is why the activities of civil society and of non-governmental groups are so important. The United States Congress finally, I guess 2 years ago, created the Middle East Partnership Act and is investing $250 million over 5 years in trying to build Israeli-Palestinian cooperative activities to try to bring people together. When I was ambassador, we had a $10 million congressional grant, and I think we used it wisely with quite a few small grants that we thought would have a larger impact within the two respective societies. So I would be hesitant to believe the people screaming on both sides about the hatred being taught on the other side. They both have to do a better job. And that's one of the action items that I think we can move forward in the period ahead.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I'm trying to juggle multiple lists of questions coming in simultaneously. Your talk was that provocative. Here's one, says, my local Jewish newspaper in Detroit, so you have a long reach, has provided a pitifully inadequate amount of coverage on the subject of the judicial overhaul and the response thereto. Why are so many in the American Jewish community seemingly indifferent to what's going on? This includes leadership organizations.
I don't know. Look, I think there have been several organizations that have taken a strong position, basically aligning themselves with President Biden in arguing that Israel needs to maintain the commitment to democracy by maintaining this separation of powers that currently exists. I think an organization, I can't be sure of this, but I think AIPAC, for example, the largest of these organizations, has not taken a position, probably not to run afoul of the current coalition in Israel. And this is an issue for us at the grassroots. You know, if we belong to these organizations, we have to, bang on the door of the chairman and the board and say we want to make our voices clear, that we support the efforts to push back against the overhaul. And in pushing back against the overhaul, I think, one of the interesting aspects here is that most people in Israel agree that the judicial system needs some reforms. It hasn't had a lot of reforms over the years, and the absence of the constitutional process is problematic. The former Chief Justice Aaron Barak, in fact, has called for the creation of a constitutional convention to finally try to bring about a written constitution to which Israelis can then refer when they're looking to deal with issues of identity and politics and so forth. But I think the grassroots in the American Jewish community, but also the broader community, should let Israel know that this is an issue that matters to us in terms of shared values.
Thank you. And we'll just try squeeze in one more. And do you think the Biden administration should approve Israel's entry into the U.S. visa waiver program on the basis of the very recent experimental loosening of Israel's longstanding double standard and how Palestinian U.S. citizens are treated?
Well, it's premature to say yes or no because the experiment is ongoing. And it's going to be a question of whether or not Israel has actually changed its practice and policy with respect to Palestinians from the occupied territories, both exiting Israel through Ben Gurion Airport and entering Israel through Ben Gurion Airport, as opposed to forcing Palestinians to go elsewhere, Jordan or elsewhere, to enter or exit the country. And then there'll be a quantitative answer to this. It'll be data-driven. And then we'll just have to see. My experience, which goes back 20 years, so it's not really relevant. 20 years ago, Israel would not have been eligible for this program, not only because of its treatment of Palestinians, but also because the rate of visa violations by Israelis who overstay their visas or who worked in the United States when they were on tourist visas was much higher than it had to be in order to qualify. That may have changed. Again, my data are now 20-something years old, but Israel has to meet the criteria of the program, and it's challenging because not just with respect to Palestinians, but also with respect to whether Israeli Jews abide by the restrictions on their respective visas.
Thank you very much. Mark, I can't remember whether I'm supposed to turn this back over to you or make a closing statement.
Let me talk just a little bit, and then I'm going to hand it back to you. And
So before Mark talks, I'm just to interject that this has been not only informative, provocative, but even a really exciting talk because you've opened up so many possibilities of thought. Thank you so much. And I thank the audience, but go ahead, Mark.
Well, Alan, you took the words out of my mouth, but I'm going to say them anyway. That was really an outstanding lecture. Insightful, informative, hard-hitting, no punches pulled. Thank you. It's really good. So I have a couple of things to go through, which I go through each time. First, I want to emphasize that this lecture program is a collaborative effort. We're a committee of nine people who put this together. The full committee is described on our website, www.meff.world. And I hope you'll have a look and take a look at the committee members and thank them silently for their hard work. And while you're there, next to that page is our donation page. And I boast to people that this lecture series is entirely supported by our viewers. I'm very proud of that. And visit our donation page. What more can I say? Every amount helps. Every amount is very much appreciated. Now, this actually is the last lecture of the 2023 series. And another transition is MEF is going to have a new president, and he's going to be Alan Taylor. And so I want to pass this back to him for his final words. And I'll probably get back one more time just to say good night. Alan, to you.
Again, thank you, Ambassador Kurtzer, for a wonderful talk. And I wanted to thank the audience for sending in terrific questions and sort of piquing our curiosity and pushing our thinking just that much further. We rely on everybody to enhance the level of communication and information exchange. I would like for all of us to give our appreciation to Mark Shulman for shepherding MEF along for the last several years. He not only kept the program running, but raised the bar for speakers, such that almost each of them has had articles in major news outlets within a month of their talk for MEF. And I think that says a lot about MEF as well. I look forward to heading up the committee, and I'd like to thank each of you, the audience, for your participation. I invite you in the audience to send in recommended topics regarding the Middle East. RITBIG, that is, the Middle East in our mind runs from, I guess, Tunisia all the way almost to China, or influences of various countries between them. And also recommend specific speakers on your topic of interest. And you can write to MEF via the MEF.world website. And again, with that, I turn it back to Mark to close it out, and thank you all.
Okay, well, I'm going to go through one final round of thanks. I'm going to thank our speaker for a great job. Thank Alan for handling the questions, which were really a challenging task. And I also want to thank the audience for joining us. I like to say each time, those of us on the committee get a lot of satisfaction out of putting this together, but it only has value because people attend. So I thank you all for joining us. And I hope you'll join us again next year. We'll keep you all informed as stuff develops. And with that, let's all have a lovely evening. Good night.